Hello everybody and welcome back to this week's video. And this week's video we're going to obviously carry on with the next topic of the Jeremiah 33rd chapter. So without further ado, let us begin with this week's video. Thanking the Lord through our Savior Jesus Christ about God's promise of restoration, which is talked about in the 33rd chapter. Because obviously, as we saw in the 32nd chapter, we saw something very important. Chapter 31 gives us the promise we saw, and chapter 32 gives us the proof, a subsequent response to what is provided in 31 was given in 32. And like that, we can see the 33rd chapter also has that significance in following this timeline. We can see as we see in the 33rd chapter, we can see it starts to carry on where God is telling Jeremiah that Judah would return. So Jeremiah bought a field. Of course, this is what we saw in the 32nd chapter, bought a field, and even while the city was under siege, we can see God proved one clear fact that the truth was what God promises he will surely perform. And that's what we understood from the 32nd chapter, where we saw about how God was giving the proof. And now we can see the 33rd chapter, where God continues the message, but with even greater hope. So God speaks in the darkest hour, we can see in the Jeremiah 33rd chapter, first 3 verses, where it says, Jeremiah is still in prison. Jeremiah is surrounded by the Babylonian army. Everything looks hopeless, we can see. But this is when God speaks again, as he says, call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show thee great and hidden things, he says. So this, we can see, seems a bit confusing at first, but it teaches us actually an important lesson. It's trying to say God does not wait for the problem to end before he speaks, we can see. And also God is also trying to say, even in the darkest hours, God is already working toward restoration. That's what God's clear point is. He's always working towards the idea of restoration, because when people see the ruins around them that are destroying them, God already sees the rebuilding, we can see. So overall, we can see God is promising us healing and peace, we can see. After this point, in the 33rd chapter, the 4th to 9th verse, God admits that the city will be damaged. There will be death, war, and destruction. But he also says that he will bring healing and health returned, and will cleanse the people from the sin, and he will forgive their iniquities they have committed. So this shows us something very powerful. But suffering is not the final chapter, which we saw about even in last week's video, as because of course judgment comes because of sin, but restoration comes because of God's mercy. There's two different values that are coming here: sin and God's mercy. Two ideas, judgment and restoration, arrive. Then we continue the 10th to 11th verse of the 33rd chapter. It is mentioned about the joy will return to the land, as God says that the silent street will again hear. Right now the land is empty, he says, but God promises that life will return, he says. This reminds us God is not only restoring buildings, we can see, but he's restoring hearts, homes, and worship. And that's the key idea God wishes to solve. And then if we carry on, we can see the righteous branch, or we can see the future king, is also mentioned in this 33rd chapter, from the 14th to the 16th verse, because it's here God repeats and confirms a promise made earlier. As of course he said, I will cause the branch of righteousness to grow up unto David. This branch points to a righteous king who brings salvation, God mentioned. And Christians understand that this is pointing towards Jesus Christ, of course, the true king who brings lasting peace and righteousness that is mentioned, and is going to be brought through the timeline of David, of course. So Jeremiah 33rd chapter here, we can understand, is not only about returning from Babylon, but it is also for a greater plan of redemption that God has in mind, we can say. And so overall, we can understand it as a conclusion from the 19th to the 26th verse. It clearly says God's covenant cannot fail. He says if day and night stops, then he promises his promise, because he says if day and night fails, then he says his promises could fail. But since creation continues, his covenant continues. And that is the key idea God is trying to suggest, we can see. And so this assures us God does not forget his people. God does not break his word. And what he promises, he will surely perform. That's the key idea. So overall, we can now see the linking chapter for the 33rd as well. As the 31st chapter gave us the proof. The 32nd chapter gave us... the 31st chapter gave us the promise. The The 32nd chapter gave us the proof, and the 33rd chapter gave us the reassurance. Step by step, an overall word for each chapter is a clear linking point, and beautifully, once again, the 33rd chapter falls in line with that again. And now, of course, in the next week's video, we'll carry on seeing more in the 34th chapter. And that's all for this week's video, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you. Bye.